hoping they multiplied since the last count. They didn't. $14.60. That's what stands between you and closing this restaurant for good. Outside, the rain taps against the window like it's trying to tell you something. And then the bell above the door rings, and an old man steps in from the cold, soaked to the bone, holding nothing but silence and hunger in his eyes. You don't know it yet, but the next 20 minutes will change the rest of your life. The restaurant had been your mother's before it was yours. She called it Delphini's after her own mother, a woman you never met, but whose recipes lived on in the cornbread you baked every morning at 5, in the way you seasoned greens with just enough vinegar to make grown men close their eyes when they took a bite. Your name is Roscoe Fairweather, and you are 63 years old. You have run this restaurant on the corner of Magnolia and 3rd Street for 19 years. Ever since your mother passed and left it to you along with her apron, her cast iron skillets, and a debt she never told you about until the lawyer read her will out loud. You paid off that debt. It took you 11 years, but you paid it. And for a while, business was good. Folks came from 3 counties over for your Sunday fried chicken. The regulars knew your name, and you knew theirs, and their children's names, and which booth old Beauregard Tillman liked to sit in because it faced the window, so he could watch the town go by while he ate his eggs. But things change. A supermarket chain opened 2 miles down the highway. Then a fast food place went up right across from the school. Then the pandemic came and took 18 months of steady customers and never quite gave them back. You held on. You always held on. That's what your mother taught you. A Fairweather doesn't fold. Not for weather, not for hardship, not for anything. But tonight, standing behind that register with $14.60 in your hand, you're starting to wonder if holding on is enough. Your electric bill is 3 weeks overdue. Your cook, a sweet young woman named Odessa Marchbanks, hasn't been paid in 2 weeks, though she keeps showing up anyway, telling you, Mr. Roscoe, know you're good for it. Your mama fed my mama when I was in her belly. I ain't going nowhere. Her kindness sits heavy on your chest, because you don't know how much longer you can accept it. You haven't paid yourself a dime in over a month. Your dinner most nights has been whatever. Didn't sell a biscuit gone stiff. The heel of a meatloaf nobody ordered. Tonight, there's a single plate left in the kitchen. Cornbread, a scoop of mashed potatoes, and the last piece of fried chicken from the day's batch. You were going to eat it after closing. It was going to be your dinner, and if you're honest with yourself, maybe your only meal today. The rain started around 6. By 8, it hadn't let up, and the streets outside had gone empty and silver under the streetlights. You told Odessa to head home early. No sense in her waiting around for customers who weren't coming in this weather. She hesitated at the door, looked back at you like she wanted to say something, then just said, "Lock up safe, Mr. Roscoe," and disappeared into the rain. You were alone with the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of water hitting the awning. Outside, you just reached for that last plate when the bell above the door rang. You looked up, surprised. It was 8:40, and you'd flipped the sign to close 20 minutes ago. An old man stood in the doorway, dripping onto the mat. He must have been near 80, maybe older. His coat was too thin for the weather, patched at the elbows with mismatched thread, the kind of patching a man does himself when there's no one left to do it for him. His shoes had holes in them you could see even from across the room. His hands trembled. You couldn't tell if it was the cold or something else. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low and rough, like gravel underwater. "I saw your light on. I didn't mean to intrude. I'll go." "Sir, wait," you heard yourself say, before you'd even decided to say it. He paused, one hand still on the door. "It's pouring out there," you said. "Coming out of the rain, at least." He looked at you for a long moment, like he was trying to figure out if you meant it, if kindness, like that still existed in the world he'd been walking through. Then he stepped inside, and you saw just how thin he was beneath that coat, how his cheekbones stood out sharp against skin, gone pale from cold and hunger. "Sit down," you told him, gesturing to the booth by the window. Beauregard's old booth, though. Beauregard had passed 3 winters back, and nobody had sat there regular since. Sit, please. He lowered himself into the seat slowly, like his knees ached with every movement. Like the simple act of sitting cost him something. He folded his trembling hands on the table and looked at them instead of at you. I don't have any money, he said quietly, like it shamed him to admit it. I wasn't looking for a handout. I just wanted somewhere warm to sit for a while, if that's all right. I'll leave when the rain lets up. You looked at that plate in the kitchen. Your dinner, the only food standing between you and an empty stomach tonight. You thought about the $14.60 in the register. You thought about your mother, Delphine, and the 100 times you'd watched her feed a stranger who couldn't pay, back when the restaurant was thriving and she could afford such kindness without a second thought. You thought about what she used to say. Roscoe, a full table and an empty pocket are two different kinds of poor. Don't never let the second kind make you forget the first. Sir, you said, walking toward the kitchen, what's your name? He looked up, surprised by the question. Thaddeus, he said. Thaddeus Calloway. Well, Mr. Calloway, you said, tonight, you're my guest. You brought out that last plate, the cornbread, the mashed potatoes, the piece of fried chicken, and set it down in front of him like he was the only customer that had ever mattered. You poured him a glass of sweet tea, the good kind, the kind you made fresh that morning, with real sugar, not the powdered stuff. Thaddeus stared at the plate like he didn't quite believe it was real. When he looked up at you, his eyes had gone glassy. Why would you do this? He asked. You don't know me. You pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. Because something about this man made you want to stay. Me. You want to know his story the way your mother always wanted. To know everyone's story. Because somebody did it for my mother once, you said. Long before I was born. She was young, pregnant with my older sister, and she and my daddy had nothing. A stranger bought them a meal in a diner just like this one, and told her, someday, when you can, you do the same for someone else. She never forgot that. She built this whole restaurant on that promise, and I guess I inherited it, along with everything else. Thaddeus picked up his fork with trembling hands and took a bite of the cornbread. You watched something shift in his face, not just hunger being satisfied, but something deeper, something that looked almost like grief and relief tangled together. This is the best meal I've had in longer than I can remember, he said. You talked while he ate. You learned that Thaddeus had once had a family, a wife, Verity, who'd passed 9 years back, and a son he hadn't spoken to in almost as long. After a falling out, neither of them had ever found the words to mend. You learned he'd worked most of his life in construction, building things up all across 3 states, and that his hands, though they trembled now, had once framed houses that families still lived in today. Where do you stay? You asked him gently. Wherever's dry, he said, not meeting your eyes. The shelter on Ferris Street, when they've got room. Under the overpass on Route 9, when they don't. Something in your chest tightened at that. You thought of your own bed, small and modest, above the restaurant, but a bed all the same, warm and dry, and yours. You come back tomorrow, you told him. Same time. I'll have a plate waiting. He shook his head. I couldn't ask that of you. You've already given me more than. I'm not asking if you can, you said, echoing something your mother used to say, word for word, like her voice was speaking through you. I'm telling you, I will. There's a difference. Thaddeus came back the next night, and the night after that, every evening around 8, after the last regular customers had gone. The bell above the door would ring, and there he'd be, a less soaked, a little more familiar, easing himself into Beauregard's old booth by the window. You fed him every night for 3 months. Some nights, it was the last plate in the kitchen, the one that would have been your own dinner. You told yourself you weren't hungry, even when you were. Odessa noticed the pattern and, instead of scolding you for giving away food you could barely afford, started making a little extra every night, in case somebody comes by needing it, she'd say, and you both knew who she meant, and neither of you spoke of the money it cost, because some things don't need spelling out between people who understand each other. You and Thaddeus talked most nights. He told you about the houses he built, the tools he still remembered the names of, even though his hands could no longer hold them steady. He described the particular satisfaction of a level frame, the smell of fresh cut lumber in early morning, the pride of driving past a neighborhood he'd built decades later and seeing porch lights on, children's bicycles tipped over in front yards, whole lives happening inside walls he'd raised with his own 2 hands. "You build something," he said one night, turning his glass of sweet tea slowly on the table, "and you think it's going to last forever. Houses, marriages, families. You think the frame is strong enough to hold anything. Turns out the frame was never the hard part." He told you about Verity, how she used to hum while she cooked. Always the same 3 or 4 notes, never quite a full song. Just enough melody to fill a kitchen. He told you the house had gone so quiet after she passed that he sometimes talked to himself just to hear a voice in the rooms, and how, after a while, even that had started to feel like it wasn't enough. Grief doesn't leave, he told you. It just learns to sit quieter in the corner, waiting for you to forget it's there before it reminds you all over again. You nodded, though you'd never lost a spouse, only a mother, and you wondered if grief wore different clothes, depending on what it had taken from you, or if underneath it all, it was always the same visitor, just wearing a different face. He told you, one rainy Thursday, about his son. "His name is Huxley," Thaddeus said, staring into his sweet tea. "We fought about the business. I wanted him to take it over, build it up the way I built it. He wanted his own life. I said some things I shouldn't have. He said some things back. Neither one of us ever picked up the phone to say sorry, and then Verity passed. And grief has a way of making silence feel safer than words. Been 9 years now. I don't even know where he lives anymore. It's not too late," you told him. Thaddeus looked at you with something between hope and hopelessness. "At my age, everything feels a little too late." You didn't have an answer for that. You just refilled his tea and let him sit in the warmth a while longer. Winter deepened. The restaurant's troubles deepened with it. You fell further behind on the electric bill. The bank sent a letter about the small loan you'd taken out to fix the walk-in freezer 2 years back. A letter with words like default and final notice that made your stomach drop every time you thought about them. You didn't tell Thaddeus any of this. You didn't tell anyone. A Fairweather doesn't fold, you kept telling yourself, even as you felt yourself bending under the weight of it all. There were nights you sat in the back office after closing, the ledger open in front of you, numbers that refused to add up no matter how many times you ran them. You thought about selling the building. You thought about what your mother would say if she knew how close you'd come to letting go of the one thing she'd worked her whole life to build. You never let Thaddeus see any of that. When he sat in his booth each evening, you made sure your face showed nothing but warmth, because whatever else was falling apart in your life, this hour with him felt like the one thing still holding steady. One evening in January, Thaddeus noticed, anyway, he always did, you'd come to realize, for a man who claimed to have nothing left, he still had a builder's eye for cracks in a foundation. "You're tired tonight," he said, watching you over his plate. "More tired than usual." "Just a long week," you told him, forcing a smile. He studied you a moment longer, the way he used to study a blueprint, looking for what didn't quite line up. "Roscoe," he said, "a man doesn't have to tell me his troubles for me to see them sitting on his shoulders. I've carried a few of my own. I know the weight of them when I see it on somebody else. It's nothing you need to worry over," you said. "You've got enough on your plate." He looked down at the food in front of him, the food you'd given him, the same food you should have been eating yourself. And something in his expression softened into something almost like sorrow. "I wish I had something to give you back," he said quietly. "You've given me more these past months than most folks give in a lifetime, and I've got nothing to offer in return but company and conversation." "That's not nothing," you told him. "That's not nothing at all." He reached across the table then and rested his trembling hand briefly over yours. A small gesture, but one that stayed with you long after he'd gone that night. back out into whatever cold corner of the world he called shelter. Then, on a Tuesday in late February, Thaddeus didn't come. You waited past 8, past 9, watching the door, telling yourself the weather must have kept him away. Though it was a clear, cold night, nothing like the storms he usually braved to get to you. You waited the next night too, and the next, and by the fourth night, a heaviness settled into your chest that had nothing to do with the restaurant's finances. Odessa found you sitting in Beauregard's old booth after closing on the fifth night, staring at an empty plate you hadn't been able to bring yourself to put away. You think something happened to him? She asked quietly. I don't know, you admitted. I don't even know his last name for certain. Calloway, he said. I don't know if that's even true. I don't know anything about him really, except that he was kind, and he was hungry, and he needed somewhere warm. You know more than that, Odessa said. You know he mattered to you. That's not nothing, Mr. Roscoe. You nodded, though the ache in your chest didn't ease. 2 more weeks passed. The restaurant's troubles came to a head. A letter arrived stating that without payment within 30 days, the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings on the building. You sat with that letter in your hands for a long time that night, in the quiet restaurant at Beauregard's booth, the same booth Thaddeus used to sit in, and you let yourself cry for the first time in longer than you could remember. Not just for the restaurant, though that alone was enough to break a man. You cried for your mother, for the promise she'd built this place on, for the possibility that after everything, after 19 years of holding on, you might be the Fairweather who finally let go. You cried too, for Thaddeus, wherever he was, however he was, hoping against hope that, wherever he'd gone, someone was being as kind to him as you tried to be. It was a Thursday afternoon, 3 days before the deadline in that letter, when the bell above the door rang during the slow hour between lunch and dinner. You looked up, expecting maybe old Mrs. Pruitt coming for her usual coffee, and instead saw a woman in a sharp gray suit, standing in the doorway, holding a leather folder against her chest like something precious. Are you Roscoe Fairweather? She asked, owner of Delphini's. I am, you said, wiping your hands on your apron, bracing yourself for more bad news. Another bill, another notice. My name is Magnolia Ashworth. I'm an attorney. I represent the estate of a man named Thaddeus Calloway. She paused, watching your face carefully. I understand you knew him. Your knees nearly buckled. You gripped the edge of the counter. Is he? Did something happen to him? Magnolia's expression softened. I'm very sorry to tell you that Mr. Calloway passed away 3 weeks ago, peacefully, in a care facility in the next county. He'd been moved there after a fall, about a month before he passed. The room seemed to tilt. You thought of all the nights you'd waited in that booth, watching the door, and how the answer had been so much sadder than you'd let yourself imagine. I don't understand, you said. Why would his estate be looking for me? Magnolia opened the leather folder and pulled out a sealed envelope, your name written across the front, in handwriting that shook, but hadn't lost its care. The same trembling hands that had once framed houses across 3 states. Mr. Calloway left very specific instructions, she said. Before I give you this, you should know something about who he was. I don't believe he ever told you his full history. You shook your head slowly. He told me he built houses, that he lost his wife, that he had a son he hadn't spoken to in years. All of that is true, Magnolia said. But before all of that, 40 years ago, Thaddeus Calloway founded Calloway Construction and Development. At its peak, it was one of the largest building firms in the Southeast. He built shopping centers, schools, entire neighborhoods. He was, by most measures, a wealthy man. You stared at her, certain you'd misheard. That can't be the same man. The Thaddeus I knew didn't have 2 coins to rub together. He slept under an overpass some nights. He gave nearly everything away, Magnolia said gently, after his wife passed, and after the falling out with his son. Mr. Calloway said he felt he'd spent his whole life building things, and had nothing left worth keeping them for. He restructured his estate, donated the bulk of his fortune to housing charities and shelters across the state, the very kind of places he later found himself sleeping in, which, he said, taught him more about grace and dignity than 40 years of business ever had. He kept only a modest reserve, which he lived on quietly, without anyone knowing who he'd once been. He told me once that he wanted, before he died, to know if there were still people in the world who would be kind to a stranger who had nothing to offer them in return. He said it was the only way he'd know the answer was true. Tears blurred your vision. You thought of every night you'd handed him that plate, never once asking for anything back, never once knowing. He found his answer in you, Magnolia said, and handed you the envelope. Your hands trembled as badly as his always had as you opened it. Inside was a letter, handwritten in that same shaking script. Roscoe, you fed me when you had nothing left to give. You gave me your own dinner, more nights than I can count, and you never once asked who I was, where I came from, or what I could do for you in return. You gave because your mother taught you to, and because it was simply who you are. In 81 years, I have known very few people like that. You told me once that a full table and an empty pocket are two different kinds of poor. I want you to know that in your restaurant, for the first time in nearly a decade, I was not poor in either way. You gave me warmth, dignity, and something I did not know I still needed, hope. That kindness in this world is not extinct. I am leaving you enough to save Delphini's and to build it into everything your mother dreamed it could be. I ask only two things in return. First, that you keep a table open, always, for anyone who walks through your door with nothing, the way you kept one open for me. Second, that if my son Huxley ever comes looking for answers about his father, you tell him the truth, that I loved him every single day of that silence, and that my greatest regret was letting pride steal 9 years we can never get back. Thank you for reminding an old man, in his final months, what it feels like to matter to someone with more gratitude than these words can hold. Thaddeus. Attached to the letter was a certified check. You had to sit down when you saw the number. Enough to pay off every debt on the restaurant 3 times over. Enough to fix the walk-in freezer, repave the parking lot, give Odessa the raise she'd more than earned, and still have enough left to build the kind of future your mother had once dreamed of for this small corner of Magnolia and 3rd. You sat in Beauregard's old booth for a long time after Magnolia left, the letter in your hands, the rain starting up again outside, tapping against that same window Thaddeus used to watch while he ate. You thought about the $14.60 that had sat in your register the night he first walked in. You thought about how close you'd come to turning that closed sign and simply eating your dinner alone, the way exhaustion and fear had tempted you to do more nights than you wanted to admit. You thought about your mother's voice, the promise she'd carried her whole life and passed down to you without you even realizing you'd been carrying it too. And you thought about a lonely old man, once wealthy beyond measure, who had walked through the world with nothing left but the hope that somewhere, someone would still choose kindness when it cost them something real. You had chosen it without knowing why, without knowing what it would mean. You had chosen it simply because it was right. 6 months later, Delphini's reopened after renovations, new paint on the walls, a repaired roof, a kitchen with equipment that finally matched the love Odessa poured into every dish. But some things you kept exactly the same. Beauregard's old booth by the window stayed just as it was, and above it, you hung a small brass plaque, the kind you'd have made special at the shop 2 towns over. It read, "Reserved for whoever needs it most tonight," on the house, always, every single night since, without fail. That table has fed someone who couldn't pay, traveler, passing through, a mother between jobs, a teenager who'd had a fight with his family and nowhere else warm to sit. You never ask their names before you feed them, though most tell you anyway, sitting there in that booth, the way Thaddeus once did. 3 months after the restaurant reopened, a man in his 40s walked through the door on a rainy Tuesday evening, hesitating in the doorway the way strangers sometimes do. Something about his eyes reminded you of someone. I'm looking for a man named Roscoe Fairweather, he said. My name is Huxley Calloway. I was told you might know something about my father. You led him to the booth by the window, sat down across from him the way you once sat, across from his father, and for the next 2 hours, over a plate of cornbread and mashed potatoes, you gave him back 9 years he thought he'd lost forever. He comes by every few weeks now. Sometimes he brings his own children, and you tell them stories about their grandfather, not the wealthy businessman from the papers, but the quiet man in the torn coat who taught a stranger, and eventually taught them that grace has a way of finding its way back to those who give it away first. You never know, when you give away your last meal, whether you are feeding a stranger or feeding the very kindness that will one day come back to save you.
Friends, this is a reminder that kindness never really gets lost. It always finds its way back. If this touched your heart, subscribe and share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next story.